South Carolina, Clemson. Need I say more? One of the best and most intense rivalries in all of college football adds another chapter on Saturday night as the Gamecocks and Tigers do battle under the lights at Williams-Brice Stadium. And these are my top storylines for South Carolina and Clemson. And guys, we start with this. This kind of feels like going in this game, especially for my old school Gamecock and Tiger fans out there. Doesn't this feel kind of like the days of old? Right? My fandom started for South Carolina, my college football fandom as a whole, end of 02, beginning of 03. That's when it really started to click, right? I think that, I had watched games as a youngster, but I didn't really understand what it meant or why it was important. End of 02, beginning of 03. That's when I became a diehard of South Carolina football and a lover of college football as a whole. And you think back to those matchups, guys, when both programs were sort of on equal footing, right? Both programs were sort of floating in that 5 to 6 win range, getting to 6 wins and getting to a bowl game. It was a really, really big deal, right? I recall, I'll never forget, guys, 2004, when South Carolina beat Arkansas, right? Savell Newton to Troy Williamson for the game-winning touchdown. And I will never forget Coach Simpson with the pick to seal that victory, by the way. That was South Carolina's 6th win of the year. I will never forget going to school that following Monday. I was in middle school, going to school that following Monday. And I had a bunch of Clemson buddies, bunch of Carolina buddies. We would all talk trash to each other, and it was a lot of fun. Going to school that Monday and just doing this. 6 wins, because that was such a big deal. Getting to a bowl game was such a big deal. That felt like winning the SEC championship at that time. Obviously, Steve Spurrier came in. He changed those expectations. He got South Carolina fans to expect much more than 6-6 and raise those expectations. But Clemson was in a similar boat, right? Where it's like the way you looked at the season rested on that final game of the year. It rested on the rivalry game because neither program was championship caliber. Neither program was competing for titles. And this season specifically has that feel. Now, would I much rather both teams be 12-0, number 1 and 2 in an Ohio State-Michigan scenario? I think I would for the national relevance and the attention on the game. But there is a beauty to it where it's like neither teams had the season they wanted to have, right? Clemson nor South Carolina. And neither team, if they win this game, are going to go through a parade and say the season was a massive success, right? There were still shortcomings and things that did not live up to expectation or live up to standard. But it's really the difference between the penthouse and the doghouse. It's really the difference between jubilation and, at least if nothing else, having bragging rights to fall back on, and for the loser, it's your worst nightmare. It is dejection. It is a demoralized feeling. It is having to live in a state of pure hell for the next 365 days. Both teams, quote unquote, successful season, or just being able to look back on this season and it be memorable in any sort of positive light, it rests on this game. Of course, you've got bowl eligibility on the line for South Carolina. And guys, I would argue this. I would argue the South Carolina-Clemson rivalry has the most juice it's had, the most excitement, the most anticipation since probably 2013. And the reason I say that is because, guys, for the longest time when Clemson was going to college ball playoffs and dominating this series and the spread was coming out, right, opening up at 24.5, and they were just dominating year after year after year, you didn't feel that excitement, guys. If you're truly honest with yourself, you didn't feel that excitement. You didn't feel that energy. You didn't feel that hope and that optimism. Even last year, the spread was 2 touchdowns, right? There was a almost sort of a delusional belief, right? I mean, I picked South Carolina to beat Clemson last year. There was a great hope because what had happened in that Tennessee game. But even then, Clemson was expected by most to win that football game. This is the first time, and I would argue a decade, where both fan bases come in a little bit on edge. Both fan bases are almost hesitant to talk their trash because in the back of their minds, they're thinking, man, is my team going to be able to cash a check that my mouth might write all week long talking trash to the other side? And I think that's something, guys, that's healthy for the rivalry. I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it is going to be a really fun weekend. And it's like the rivalry's got that juice back where it all rests on this Saturday. Like, to even remotely look back at the season as it's one that we even want to talk about. This game on Saturday, it means everything for each individual side. Guys, moving to the game, the matchup, one of the biggest storylines, guys, in this one, and it's so low-hanging fruit, I feel like, to talk about. What's your keys to the game? Well, I mean, turnover battle. You got to win the turnover margin. Like, that one's so no-duh, right? Nobody goes into a game and says, well, yeah, well, I mean, we could turn the ball over a couple times, lose the margin, +3, +4. We'll be fine. No big deal, right? Like, nobody's going to say that. But what's interesting about this one, Clemson's had a turnover problem all year long. Guys, Clemson has turned the football over at least once in every game this season. They haven't gone a game without coughing it up. 13 fumbles to their credit, one of the worst in college football. 20 total turnovers lost. That is tied for 111th in college football. Now, South Carolina has been abysmal for the most part defensively this season, but last couple weeks, 3-game winning streak, South Carolina's defense has started to make some plays. It even started in that Jacksonville State game where that game was ugly. The defense wasn't good, but Stone Blanton's pick 6 at the end of that game, some other turnovers happening as well. Gamecocks defense started to be opportunistic. Then you look at Vandy. Then you look at Kentucky. South Carolina, guys, has forced 10 turnovers in the last 3 weeks. I know 2 of those opponents are JSU and Vandy. I get that. Still, the Gamecocks defense is making plays. So, turnover margin. And guys, if you've watched this rivalry long enough, you know how big turnovers are. You know how costly they can be. When South Carolina was beating Clemson year after year after year, the Gamecocks had great teams, no doubt. But one of the things that happened on a yearly basis and why South Carolina was whipping Clemson like a rented mule, it was turnover margin. It was turnover battle. The Gamecocks were constantly. I mean, guys, you go back and think the last time South Carolina beat Clemson at Willie B, it was 2013. Gamecocks won the turnover margin in that game. I think it was like 4-1. So it is a very, very big deal. Clemson's been turning it over all year. Carolina starting to force some. How much of a factor does that play on Saturday night? Sticking with Carolina's defense, guys, it's no secret. You got to stop Will Shipley, and Phil Maffa. I'm getting the names mixed up here. But that's where it starts and ends for the Gamecocks. If you can't win in the trenches and you can't get a push and you can't slow down that two-headed monster, that is Will Shipley and Phil Maffa, it's going to be a long night. You've got to make Clemson one-dimensional, similar to what you did in that game against Kentucky, where, Ray Davis had one big run. He popped off a couple, but Kentucky did not ride him the way I thought they would. He wasn't nearly as productive as some of us thought he would be. Now, Clemson's a much better version of what Kentucky does, right? Their offensive line's been somewhat questionable, somewhat inconsistent throughout this season. The Garrett Riley offense hasn't quite lived up to expectation and standard. But let's also point out, by the way, Clemson has won 3 games in a row. They're feeling much better about themselves. The quarterback play has been better. The offense has been better. But it all starts for South Carolina slowing down that running game of Will Shipley and Phil Maffa, especially Will Shipley, who has torched the South Carolina defense in his 2 years in this game. Physicality up front, that's what's going to win. What does South Carolina's front seven, what kind of answer do they have? And on that note, do we see the 3-3-5 stick around, right? So a lot of that in the Kentucky game, and the results have been better. The results were much better last week. Is South Carolina able to win that battle at the point of attack, and how do they contain that two-headed monster of Will Shipley and Phil Moffitt? Because, guys, if you do that, and we're about to talk about him in a second, but if you do that, you ask any Gamecock fan out there, heck, you ask any Clemson fan out there, if South Carolina can slow down the running game of Clemson enough, and this thing turns into a four-quarter quarterback battle between Spencer Rattler and Cade Klubnik, I don't know anybody out there who ain't taking Rattler 10 times out of 10, especially after what he did at Clemson last year. On that note, guys, speaking of Spencer Rattler, one last go, at least we think. No, one last go for the Gamecocks signal caller looking to move to 2-0 against Clemson. And, guys, this is a ball game that could truly cement his legacy, right? As one of the all-time greats, I think, in Gamecocks football history. I know that sounds weird to say, but you think about what's on the line for Spencer Rattler. This hasn't been the season that anybody wanted, right, from a team perspective. But you move to 2-0 against the rival, especially if you torch them through the air again and you have a good game. But you look at what Rattler needs to do, guys, on Saturday night. I don't think he's got to do what he did last year at Clemson. He doesn't necessarily have to throw for 330, 340, whatever it was. But taking care of the football, right? Against Kentucky, like, people are going to look and say, oh, Rattler wasn't that good. The offense stunk. I mean, he wasn't the Rattler we've seen at home, certainly in the other games. But you know what Spencer Rattler did so well in that game? He was efficient, and he took care of the football, and he utilized his legs in the running game. I think you're going to have a similar performance because, guys, Clemson's defense, they are legit. Say whatever you want about the Tigers. They got one of the best defenses in college football, all three levels. That pass defense he torched, they're much better this year. That linebacking core, they got the best duo of linebackers, I probably think, in all of college football. And their front four, it's as good as any as you're going to see across college football with Tyler Davis and Rook Orororo. I think that's how you say his name. Whatever it is, either way, Spencer Rattler, the opportunity that he's got on Saturday night to cement his legacy as one of the best in Gamecocks football history at that position, you got to think that's a major motivating factor for him in this game. The last game for him at Williams-Brice Stadium, and potentially wearing the garnet and black, because even if South kind of makes a bowl, guys, I mean, there's a good chance probably he goes, gets ready for the NFL draft, what have you, who knows. That may not happen, but still, this may be the last time we see Spencer Rattler in the garnet and black. Does he go out with a bang? Guys, sticking with the matchup offensively that I feel like everyone has been talking about this week. Xavier Legette against Nate Wiggins on the outside. A massive matchup on Saturday night. And a Clemson fan pointed this out that, hey, Clemson doesn't play man, they play zone more often. So it's kind of silly that folks are talking about this. But still, it's fun. It's fun to talk about key matchups and guys that'll be going mano-a-mano, one-on-one. There's going to come a point where Nate Wiggins is right on Xavier Legette. You've got to think that Clemson is going to do everything in their power to take 17 away. You have to think, guys. Like, because if I'm Clemson, I'm not letting one guy beat me. If South Carolina beats me, somebody else has got to have the game of their life. I'm not letting 17 be that dude. Now, that is much easier said than done. And I can't wait to watch this matchup, guys. I can't wait to watch these two guys go at it, a pair of dudes who are definitely going to be playing on Sundays. The physicality, the speed, the hands, guys. We've seen it all year from Xavier Legette. And give Nate Wiggins his credit. One of the better defensive backs in college football. Going to be a ton of fun who wins that matchup because, guys, back to Rattler, back to Legette. South Carolina, I think, is going to have to win this game through the air. They're going to have to lean on the passing game. They're going to have to lean on Rattler, right? Because of the obvious mismatch in the trenches and what that means for South Carolina. So that matchup on the outside, Xavier Legette, Nate Wiggins, that one's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to draw a lot of attention. It's drawn a lot of attention this week on social media. I can't wait to watch those two dudes go at it. Speaking of the offensive line, the running game, guys, admittedly, after watching that game against Kentucky, I am a bit more nervous about the offensive side of the football than I was before I witnessed that game. Because Kentucky dominated you up front. Let's call it for what it is. Kentucky won that football game in the trenches, or at least Kentucky's D-line against South Carolina's offensive line. Give Spencer Rattler a ton of credit for evading pressures. And, Kentucky only got 2 sacks, but they were in his hip pocket all night long. I mean, this guy, Spencer Rattler, had 10 carries, guys. That just goes to show you how many times he was rolling out, getting out of the pocket, making something out of nothing, what have you. After being stymied against Kentucky a week ago, and Deion Walker just having his way with Carolina, play after play after play, number 0 for Kentucky. A week after that, can South Carolina get any sort of run push? Can it get any sort of run push? I mean, listen, the Gamecocks, they run for 100 yards and winning this football game. If South Carolina runs for 70 yards, I could convince you, and I could convince myself, South Carolina is winning this football game. Like, it's the same story all year long, guys. Carolina ain't got to rush for 200. They just have to be effective enough. Mario Anderson, that running game, they just have to be effective enough to keep Clemson honest, right? They've just got to be effective enough to have a semblance of balance to where Spencer Rattler can operate. Because if you do that, hey, guys, this has been a season of where, hey, if Spencer Rattler's got a clean pocket, sets his feet, delivers a throw, there have not been many times where that has happened, where it has not been a throw right on the money. So, can you generate any sort of run game? You're depleted at running back right now. It's Mario Anderson and Dontavius Braswell. That's it. That's who you're rolling with right now. Can Mario Anderson have one of his better games this season, lead that Gamecocks rushing attack, and at least keep Clemson honest? Guys, moving to special teams. We look back at last year's game, and I've joked about this, but I think it's true. Last year's game is where Kai Kroger set a lot of these unrealistic expectations about his game, right? So many people, Kai Kroger sucks. He's having a terrible year. Kai Kroger's chilling on NIL. And I think it's just because he was such a weapon in that Clemson game last year. I mean, a couple punts down inside the 10, down inside the 5. We saw him last year with the fakes, the touchdown passes, right? Beamer ball was massive in that game against Clemson last year. Massive. I mean, think about it, guys. Not just the punts. Clemson had a fumble on special teams on that kickoff return where they tried to out Beamer ball, and it blew up in their face. Does Beamer ball play a massive role yet again? Do we see special teams have as much a role? Because, too, it's like in these rivalry games, guys, it's stuff like that does show itself more. And I think a lot of that has to do with the nerves and the emotions and just the adrenaline's pumping. And, like, you do things that are out of character, right? So you might fumble a punt. You might muff something. You might drop the football on a kickoff, whatever it might be, right? You might miss a field goal, whatever it is. So I just wonder, does Beamer ball play that big of a role yet again? It's been there in spurts for South Carolina this year. But the Gamecocks, I would argue, certainly need it to come up big on Saturday night. Guys, all week long and going into the game, of course, home field advantage is going to be talked about. Some of you are not going to like where I'm going with this, and that's okay. Home field advantage is going to be mentioned. Both these teams are bad on the road. The good news is the Gamecocks are the home team in this one. Clemson's 1-3 on the road. And you look at some of the crowds they've played against, right? I mean, I think the most was like 50,000, 55,000 somewhere. Safe to say, Willie B is going to be an environment unlike anything Clemson's been in this season. But with that being said, I pose this question. How much does home field advantage really matter in the South Carolina-Clemson series? Because, guys, you look back at the numbers, and again, nobody wants to hear this ahead of a home game at night. I get that, but it's just an intriguing stat. Don't shoot the messenger. It's just an intriguing stat. The road team is 5-0 in the last 5 in covering the spread. Also, not going to like to hear this, but it's just real. South Carolina has not beaten Clemson at home since 2013. And Clemson all time, guys, they are 52, 32, and 3 at Williams-Brice Stadium. And if you look back at this series, guys, you go back all the way to the 90s, the road team has had a strange amount of success in this series. The road team has fared really, really well. So I'm not questioning Gamecock Nation. I'm not questioning the passion, the energy, the excitement, the light show. I'm not questioning any of it. All I'm saying is what history would tell you is that picking a win because of home field advantage, solely because of that, that's not typically the best route to take in this series, because home field advantage, it hasn't always spelled success. And guys, admittedly, I'm going to go a step further. You look back at last weekend, South Carolina, Kentucky. I wasn't in the building, but I talked to some who were. Guys, Willie B was dead in the second and the third quarter. So this defense having a big game, this defense playing one of their best games, I think is huge. Because think about it, guys. If your defense isn't good, if Clemson's able to run the football and pick up 5, 6, 7 yards of carry, that demoralizes not just the football team, but it takes the crowd out of it. And all of a sudden, home field advantage doesn't mean quite as much as we once thought it did. So home field advantage can be a very real thing on Saturday night, but it comes down to that Gamecocks defense making big plays early, probably forcing a couple turnovers, and keeping that crowd energetic, keeping that environment hostile. That's what it comes down to when you're talking about the home field advantage that South Carolina is hanging their hat on. And finally, guys, when you look at this game, I don't have to explain to you all or convince you all why is it a big deal to beat Clemson? Well, because it sucks to lose to them, right? I would think most folks probably, and this is fair to say, on both sides of the rivalry, you hate losing to your rival more than you enjoy beating them, because the pain of loss in this game and the hell that you have to endure, it's far worse than the jubilation. The celebration's great, right? The celebration's awesome, but man, you just don't want to lose it, right? So I don't have to convince you why it's a big deal to win, but the significance this specific season for South Carolina of beating Clemson, not just beating Clemson, but beating Clemson to get to 6 wins, making it back-to-back wins over Clemson. Guys, that'd be the first time since 2012, 2013. And also, Shane Beamer moving to 2-1 against Dabo Swinney. Guys, that would be a very, very big deal. You talk about from perception of the programs, both locally and nationally. You talk about recruiting. You talk about going out and getting talent in the transfer portal. Guys, you talk about the significance. Hey, let's just be honest with ourselves. You talk about the significance of beating Clemson in regards to what this offseason would look like. NIL. Folks are going to be a lot more willing to open their wallets and give if you beat the arch rival in the last game. Nobody on the South Carolina side is going to throw a parade and claim this season as a massive success, nor should they, even if you win on Saturday. But I tell you what, guys, it'll be much more fun to talk about the 2023 season if you win and you can say, you know what, even in Beamer's worst year, what you expect to be his worst year, South Carolina went to a bowl game and they beat their arch rival. Things didn't completely fall off the rails. That will at least be something you can look back on positively. You lose this game, nothing about the 2023 season will be viewed in a positive light. That's the difference. You win this game or lose this game, It literally dictates completely how you look back on the season. So it's huge for a number of reasons. And I don't need to explain to you guys any further why it means everything to people in this state. South Carolina, Clemson, yet again, a Palmetto Bowl we're all sure to remember.